Welcome to the Performance Code, the official podcast of PCodeNation.com and the Performance Code community. Tune in each week as top performers and fitness experts share their tactics and strategies to get you on the fast track to achieving maximum results. And now your host, Justin Scollard.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Justin Scollard, Performance Code Podcast, episode number 9. Time is flying. 9 episodes in already. And I am so thankful that you guys have chosen to listen to me. You got a lot of options out there. So it is my duty to bring to you the most relevant and actionable information I possibly can each and every week. So I got a really cool show ahead of us. Dr. Mike T. Nelson is going to be in the house. He's going to drop some wisdom, some knowledge bombs on y'all about metabolic flexibility, functional strength training, and just good old-fashioned health in general. So before we get into that, I wanted to remind you that I'm offering up some free coaching. If you want to just head over to PCodeNation.com, you're going to see a tab for free coaching. And essentially all that is, guys, you just book a 30-minute phone call with yours truly, and we're going to chat. It's not a sales pitch. I'm not trying to sell you a program. I'm legitimately just interested in hearing from my audience and getting to know you on a one-to-one basis. I will not always be offering a one-to-one phone call like this. There will come a time where that just doesn't make sense anymore. But for right now, lines are open. Go ahead and book your 30-minute call with me. That's PCodeNation.com, and you'll see the tab once you're there. Of course, there's always that free strength course that you can opt into and check out the programs while you're there. All right, guys. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Mike T. Nelson. What is up, P-Code Nation? This is Justin Scollard. So I got a very special guest today. He's a good friend of mine. We met about a year ago at a business retreat, and we've been able to stay in touch ever since. He is a PhD in exercise physiology. He has his BA in natural science, his MS in biomechanics. He's a blogger at MikeTNelson.com, and I believe AKA Extreme Human Performance.
Yep, correct.
All right. Well, I already said his name and his website, but I'm here with Dr. Mike T. Nelson, everybody. Woo!
Hey.
Yeah. Okay, so this guy is really interesting, and him and I have a lot in common. I was reading his bio earlier today to get ready for this interview, and come to find out, he was once a 6'3", 155-pound.
Oh, yeah.
I hesitate to use the word weakling, but I mean...
Look more like an eel.
Yeah, totally. I was the exact same way. I mean, that's kind of like what inspired me to do all this, right?
Nice, yeah.
So what was it about, that, and what was it about, what was your first, I guess, introduction to the world of size and strength and weight training?
Yeah, so it was basically just to get bigger for being that size. Mm-hmm. Didn't really do anything in high school. They had the presidential fitness test, which was just utterly horrible. I literally wanted to call in sick like every day.
Yeah.
And I think it actually gave me a really bad taste for health and fitness because it's, let's just test everyone. Ooh, look at all the studs. They did great. Yay. Ooh, you're horrible.
Yeah.
Like I remember doing the pull up, and so they put you up on the bar, and he goes, "Okay, you can start now." I'm like, I am trying. He's like, "Well, you're not moving at all." I'm like, yeah.
Oh my God.
But you would think then in the high school, then you would say, okay, well, that's where you start. Let's teach you how to do something intelligently. Mm-hmm. But it was just, let's just test you, and you people are great and you people suck. So I didn't really do much after that. I played basketball a little bit, messed up my knees, played golf in my junior year just to get free golf lessons, no other reason. So when I went to college, then I took a strength and conditioning course. And I was like, well, this will be fun. It was a very practical exercise class. We had to take a bunch of PE credits. And I remember the coach coming in and looking at us, and he goes, "All right, some of you people in here need to lose a lot of weight. And some of you, oh God, especially you," like points at me, "need to gain weight." I was like, oh, okay. And he gave us like one day of how to do basic exercises, and then we never saw him the rest of the quarter. It was just the TA checks you in. It was just a free-for-all. So yeah, it was just, from there I just started learning on my own and making a whole bunch of mistakes and trying stuff just to see what would happen.
Wow, that's actually really funny because verbatim, that's the reason why we're sitting here today. That's the reason why I opened up a gym. That's the reason why I became a personal trainer. In general, it's the reason why I like totally overcompensated was because of this damn presidential fitness exam.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, I write about this in the Performance Code book that like it was literally something out of a movie where it was the pull-up bar. Mm-hmm. It was me and like 10 guys that I knew. They were all my buddies, all in PE class together. And the Coach Hearn, was standing next to the pull-up bar. You know, okay, all right, Casey Baldega, you're up. And everyone's like, yeah, Casey, go get it, yeah. And he jumps up and he does like, 10 pull-ups, and the crowd goes wild, like, whoa, he did, yeah. High five him. All right, the next guy, whatever, go up there and do it. And he goes up and he gets like 6 or 7, and everyone's like, yeah. And then like, I'm next. And they're like, all right, Scholar, here we go, man. And like all my buddies were like, get it, Scholar, get it. And in my mind, I'm a total tough guy.
Yeah.
And so I jump up there and hang from the bar.
Yeah.
I literally just, my legs were flailing. I couldn't even do a single fucking pull-up. And I just decided right then and there, like that's just not my life. That's just not for me. And I can literally, within a month from then, bought a book on how to gain mass and started devouring all that content.
Which book was it? Do you know? Just curious.
Anthony Ellis.
Oh,
do you remember him?
Old school. Yeah.
Like late 90s. Like, it was skinnyguy.net. He was one of the pioneers about this whole thing. He had a forum. He had this packet that you would buy for like $100, and it had like a fat caliper and in the book, and it was extensive. He was actually really good. I think he was a disciple of Body for Life.
I was say Bill Phillips is what it sounds like.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And some people kind of give him shit for it because they say that he might have ripped him off a little bit. But I got to say, like, I credit him to my getting started on the right foot, I should say, because he really broke it down. Yeah. So now, enough about me and enough about all the presidential fitness exams. I'm sure a few of you out there could probably relate to this. I doubt that it's just randomly with Mike and myself. But so then you go off and you take some strength conditioning classes in college. And then when was that shift? When did you know that like this was going to be the time that you're going to dedicate your life to?
Yeah, I always enjoyed the exercise phys, the anatomy stuff. So when I did my Bachelor of Arts, I took anatomy and physiology just for fun. Because at St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, they had one of the rare programs where you could actually do cadaver work as an undergrad. So you didn't necessarily have to be in the physical therapy program or other programs to do it. So I loved that. That was just amazing. The professor was super interesting. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I thought about just doing physiology full time. But I didn't know what to do with that on the other end. So I used to take apart everything in the house and not put it back together. So nice. People are like, oh, well, you should go into, mechanical or biomedical engineering. And I was like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. And so that's how I went off to Michigan Tech for 2 years, did a bunch of engineering classes, realized that requires a lot of math. And even the undergrad math it's just not an easy subject for me. I almost basically failed out of math in high school and algebra. Yeah, totally. So it was good that I was at a small, private college because I could get help with, I was in the TA's office all the time, the professor's office. So I made it through all that stuff. And I finished that and I said, I'm never going back to school. Then I went off and did my master's. So it was almost like 8 years full time. And by now you had like a bachelor's in natural science already? So I did a bachelor in natural science, 2 years of postgrad, and then 2.5 years for a master's in mechanical engineering, biomechanics. And although my research ended up being on heat transfer because I couldn't get funded from the solid mechanics department. So I created this basically computer model of how to zap monkey heads. So if you set them down in front of a big microwave transmitter, we wanted to know how much heat was actually distributed through different types of monkeys. Oh, wow. So we had a large sweating monkey, we had hairy monkey, we had non-hairy monkey. Kind of like people. You got like the big sweaty guy, you got like the skinny guy. And then we used different types of transmitters, different size fans. So it was actually later declassified by the military. So at the time they said, oh, this is for, collision avoidance systems on cars, just like in the mid-90s. Oh, wow. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure, whatever. I'm like, well, why are there 3 people from Brooks Air Force Base in Texas on this? And then later it was declassified as the military was building what's called they called it a ray gun. It's actually the active denial system. So you'd point it at a crowd of people. It feels like your skin is being burnt by a light bulb because there's not any penetration depth in the skin. So people will disperse kind of out of the way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Jeez.
which is kind of wacky.
Wait, so then you were the guy testing this? Like
I was the guy creating the computer model that later was tested at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, didn't see that coming.
No, so that was a little interesting.
Wow.
So I like the biomedical stuff. I started working for a cardiology company.
Yeah.
And within 2 years, they said, oh, we if you want to take classes, we'll pay for it. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I started taking more advanced physiology classes. And then that led to actually being in the PhD program for biomedical engineering, which I finally got into.
Wow.
And I finished all the classwork there except for 2 classes. And at that point, for like 3 years, I would just go to exercise conferences for fun. I would harass trainers about why they don't read research because I assumed every trainer must read research.
Because they already know the answers. So why bother, right?
Yeah.
Trainers, man. I'm a trainer. I've been a trainer for 13 years.
Yeah.
But, I think that's it's not, I mean, listen, if a person's, philosophy works and they're getting good results, fine. But often that's not the case. And then it seems like a lot of these guys kind of get stuck in their way. Like what worked for them, or they, practice a certain methodology of movement, and to get them out of that box, you could generalize it as like the bodybuilder camp and the machines versus free weight camp. And to get people to like try different things, it's like pulling teeth sometimes, especially these trainers. So
super hard. So just fast forward, then I finally had a sort of what I call the blinding flash of the obvious that, oh, okay, so if I do switch and do a PhD in exercise phys and I finish that and nobody cares,
right.
I can just keep doing the same job I'm doing now because I could just stay in the med tech field.
Yeah.
So I started training people on the side, and then probably 11 years ago started doing it as a business, which meant I actually started charging people instead of sending them the horrible programs I wrote for free from 5 years previous.
Right. Yeah.
And then did a PhD in exercise physiology that took actually 7 years because I kind of had to go back and start over again. So
how the hell? I mean,
I don't recommend that pathway to anybody listening. It's like 18 years.
I gotta give it to you, man. I tried to get through like a year and a half of college, and I was just like, fuck. And math was my big stumbling point too.
Math was brutal for me.
We're talking like algebra 1.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, I don't care, forget it. I'll hire someone to divide my fractions for me.
Yeah,
it's cool. Like no worries. So you did your main focus for your PhD was this idea of metabolic flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Am I correct there?
Yep, metabolic flexibility, and I did a little bit of work with heart rate variability.
Yeah, all super interesting stuff. And I don't mean to date you here, but when was this that you were doing this?
I started my research. Let's see, so it was 9 years ago now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it at least to me, and maybe I've just been living under a rock for a while, but it seems like this idea of like, metabolic flexibility, which I think we could maybe for the layman call it like meal nutrient timing, carb cycling. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they're all definitely related in there.
Right. Mm-hmm. They're all related. And it seems like to me, this is relatively new, but obviously you've been doing this for 10 years now. So explain to our listeners what this kind of is in a nutshell.
Yeah, so metabolic flexibility in essence is using the right fuel at the right time. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of talk now about ketogenic diets and super low carb diets, and then in the past it was the reverse, super high carb diets, and everything kind of oscillates back and forth between the extremes. So metabolic flexibility would say that fat is a really good fuel to be used, but primarily more at rest or low intensity.
Yep.
And carbohydrates are a really good fuel to be used, but primarily more at a higher intensity.
Right.
So it's not necessarily that one is better or worse than the other. You actually want the ability to use both, and then you want the ability to switch back and forth.
Totally.
So, and I think that's slowly becoming, I don't know, dare I say, more popular now.
I think it is.
I
mean,
that's a good thing.
We've been preaching that here. By the way, we're recording this episode in my gym right now, Strength RX.
Very nice.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Beautiful. It's a very classic, rip your shirt off, chalk your hands up.
I like the old school feel. That's
strength
my
conditioning
favorite
gym,
by far.
But we've been preaching this for a long time of just the idea of like using carbohydrates as a tool. Mm-hmm. And bodybuilders have known this for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And I think people kind of go, oh, well, I don't want to be a bodybuilder, so I'm going to discount everything they have to say. And I think the CrossFit world and any sort of like, just functional aesthetic world is now kind of going like, oh, wait a second. Maybe
they got some stuff right.
Right. and it's like carbohydrates have been demonized for a long time. Well, like you said, it was fats. Fats would kill you, right?
Too much fat, no good.
Carbohydrates will kill you. And the idea is like, well, no, it just really depends on what your activity level is like. You're right. If you're just a big couch potato and you're sitting there stuffing 500 grams of carbs a day, and
it's not going to end well.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Terrible. Now, if you're a high level endurance athlete, that's not only a good thing, it's required.
Especially with high volumes. I mean, you even see some games athletes that are up in that high of a range too.
Totally.
Well, successful ones, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm potentially doing something else on the side, but we'll let CrossFit figure that one out as it comes. And I know from a personal standpoint that I've experimented with paleo and the ketogenic and this idea of, well, in the absence of carbohydrate or glucose, let's call it, your body creates ketones.
It can, over a period of time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it takes some time. And that's sort of that lethargic phase people go through, right? And that's usually where folks fall off, I'd imagine, too. They start feeling
feels
shitty.
Like crap.
You're right. Yeah. I always felt just not great. You know what I mean? There'd be moments of clarity when I was like in a state of ketosis where it'd be like, my brain was working really well because I know ketone bodies in the brain tend to work well together. But then you go try to lift weights and it's just, you feel weak. I felt like I was a little more achy. I just wasn't recovering quite as well.
Yeah. I keep trying to, personally, I like to try out all sorts of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I've tried it off and on a whole bunch of times. And, to maybe some of the hardcore ketogenic people listening, I probably didn't give it long enough. I may not have had enough fat. Right. And but the last time, I bought some strips and was monitoring my glucose, and I've got the ability to measure ketones in my blood now, even though the stupid strips are $4 a strip. But, just to see where you're at.
Right.
And the last time I tried it, I guess, semi-seriously was almost probably 2 years ago. And looking back now, I'm like, it was a horrible idea to begin with, because I was training for just a novice local strongman competition. And I was probably 4 weeks out. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to start adding, more medleys and that kind of stuff in, some more metabolic conditioning. And for whatever reason, I got it in my head that I should try a ketogenic diet at the same time.
I hear that a lot. You're not alone.
And looking back, I'm like, this is just so stupid. But what happened was I made the mistake of not looking at my training and nutrition together, which I normally do. And I made it, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks, if even that. And a coach I was working with had sent me a cake for graduation or something, I think it was. And I had put it in the fridge. So I'm like, it'll keep. I'll just wait till, the contest is over or whatever. And I think it was about 2 weeks into it. It was I remember in the afternoon, I was just super stressed out. Training was been just crap. I didn't feel good. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, there's birthday cake in the fridge. Right. And so I ate half of it in one sitting, and training was great after that.
Glycogen swell.
I felt great. And that was
energy.
The end of my last ketogenic stint.
Yeah. And by the way, we're not recommending that you eat cake, but the point here is that you use these carbohydrates to facilitate your training, because what Mike was saying is that if at a period of rest, fat's a great energy source.
Yeah, definitely.
When you are going into a period of high intensity, on the other hand, it just takes too long for your body to convert fat into energy. And when you can just get out, you can just literally, I'm about to work out. After we finish this, we're going to do 17.2, which I'm not looking forward to at all.
I saw people in DC last week doing that.
Yeah, but I got my energy bars waiting for me, because 15, 20 minutes before my training session, I'm going to put that down. I'm going to get a quick 25, 30 grams of well, let's just be real, sugar, essentially, in my system, because I'm going to go right into a workout. And that's the difference. I wouldn't do that unless it was either right before or right after. Anytime other than that in the day, pretty low carbs for me. What do you feel about like the post workout recovery shake?
I think it's generally a good idea. The caveat is if you look at the actual science on what's called nutrient timing. So classic study, one of the first studies was done by Paul Cribb out of Australia. They had a drink that was protein, creatine, and carbohydrates. And they had two groups of people, pretty, high level athletes. I think they were bodybuilder athletes. They'd use DEXA scans. So very well done, very well controlled study. And in the one group, they had the beverage in the morning and at night. And the other group, they had one before training and after training.
Yep.
So all their macronutrients, calories, everything else was identical. The only thing they changed was the timing of when they had the beverages. And in that study, they actually did see a pretty big difference in the groups. Now, that study was not replicated by other groups, similar design, similar type thing. So the hardcore research now on nutrient timing is pretty mixed. The caveat is that no one ever really got worse from that. So it was just they were not extremely that much better. And the other part, in those studies, they're only changing the timing. In reality, what I find is when I work with people, if I say, okay, I want you to have, before your weight training sessions, some carbohydrates and protein before, some carbohydrates and protein after. A lot of time that's usually in addition to everything else they're doing. So I'm technically changing their macronutrients, I'm changing their calories, maybe playing around with the quality a little bit, and I'm playing around with their timing. So I'm technically changing multiple things on purpose. So it's a little bit different than a lot of the pure studies.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, okay, you got, and by the way, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, but the way I understand it is growth hormone and insulin have an inverse relationship.
They do. Fasting will dramatically increase your levels of growth hormone. Fasting will drop insulin levels, correct.
So there's a couple of points I guess I could touch on here, but staying in line with just sort of this idea of post-workout, as I understand it, you go into a training session, like a CrossFit workout or a really intense strength and conditioning workout of any sort, glycogen levels are low, and your body will, if in the absence of dietary sugars, will start to break down muscle mass to turn it into glucose to bring blood sugars back up to regain homeostasis. Is that
it can?
On or off?
That's correct.
Okay.
I mean, you will have more breakdown of proteins possibly for that reason. The debate is how much of that is there and how much of that is elevated more than normal. So that's kind of the debatable part. And the other part of that argument that I think people forget is, well, how did you get low levels of muscle glycogen? Right? So I can do an overnight fast and I can drop levels of liver glycogen.
Right.
But to get muscle glycogen low, I basically have to do a fair amount of muscular work and not replace those carbohydrates.
Okay.
So that's the other part too, that if people are entering that state, I'm also thinking in the back of my head, well, what were they doing that they got to that state before they got to the training also?
And what would be some like physical signs, like if you were to go into a training session, like, or just in general, of like if your muscle glycogen is low and you're
Yeah, there's no real good way to measure it. I mean, lab equipment, biopsy, that type of thing. But usually I tell people just, no one wants a needle stuck in their thigh.
Probably not going to be doing that.
Not so good. There is some ultrasound stuff now, like muscle sound, things of that nature. But I usually tell people just monitor your performance.
Yeah.
So if you're doing like kind of a high glycolytic type work where the main fuel is carbohydrates or stored carbohydrates, which are glycogen, like your upcoming CrossFit type session, then if your performance is dropping, the first thing I'm going to look at is how many total carbohydrates do you have per day, and then how many do you maybe have beforehand. And a lot of times, especially if males are very active, their carbohydrate intake may be just too low.
Right.
And even just bumping that up, they'll see a big change in performance with that.
Totally.
So that's kind of the first thing I look at. It's a little bit anecdotal, but that's probably one of the better ways of checking it out.
Yeah, well, and I kind of look at it as like glycogen levels being a bucket.
Yep.
And you want to keep the bucket full without spilling over, because if it spills over, we're going to start accumulating body fat, right?
You can, yeah. That's the old bodybuilding analogy. And for the most part, I would say that it is true.
Okay.
I mean, if someone has glycogen stores that are completely full and you just, feed them a crap ton of carbohydrates, it's, got to go somewhere. And if you're not burning it, you're going to be storing some of it.
Right. There's always the exception of the rule. There's always that one guy who just eats terribly and just shredded. And you're like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Bastard.
That's part of the exception to that is a study by Levine at Mayo from 2005, I think. They took just not athletes, but people into the study. They said, okay, we're going to overfeed you guys by 1,000 calories per day starting Monday. And we're going to do this for 8 weeks. And the thought was, okay, you're going to gain about 15 pounds of fat. And so they run the study, they do everything. And what they found was some people did gain about 14 pounds of fat. A couple people only gained like 2 pounds of fat. And they're like, well, what the hell is that? But in the study, they just told them just don't change your exercise routine, but they didn't lock them up or they didn't monitor their exercise really intense or movement. And they found that the people who were overfed and gained a lot of weight, it just didn't really move that much more.
Right.
The people who only gained like a couple pounds, they're kind of your classic, more your hard gainer. They kind of walk around more, they twitch more, they fidget. They actually unconsciously increase something called NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis.
Interesting.
And they burn off more of that overfeeding, so to speak.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which also explains why, calories and everything at the end of the day do add up and matter. But if you're like a person and you're trying to keep even logs on yourself, if you're unconsciously moving more, you may not pick that up. So I'll use like a Fitbit looking at step count and some other stuff like that just to try to get an idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and that's becoming so popular these days too, just the wearables and everyone tracking their almost to a fault. Fuck,
well, that's the other extreme. Because in fitness, we can't leave anything in the middle. Right. So now we've got the calorie count, and I don't find the calorie count is that useful on any of them. I like the step count because it gives people an idea and awareness of about what they're doing.
You're right.
But again, if you're pretty active and walking around a lot, after a while, do you need it? Probably not.
Right. Yeah. And I think, going back to this idea of most, especially active males, just not eating enough. And that's a big one that we see here in the gym. I mean, we start every membership off with just like a one-on-one intro session.
Nice.
And that's just our opportunity to get to know the potential client. And if it's a guy, almost every single one of them wants to put on some size and wants to increase their strength, right? When I probe a little bit deeper and I say, now I want you to give me an exact rundown of everything you ate yesterday. And rarely do I have anyone who's specific with their diet. It's always kind of like, well, I had an egg sandwich, and then I had dinner.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, well, listen, man, I wrote a blog about this called "You Can't Train Like an Animal and Eat Like a Bird."
Oh, yes, I like that.
And that's the biggest thing that we see is just this confusion around it, where they want this body type, they want this athletic, developed, muscular, lean body, and they just assume that means dieting and then weight training. When in reality, in my experience and what I've seen with a lot of people is when they, like you said, bump up their carbs, bump up their overall calories, they, if they're heavier and they need to lose weight, sometimes that's enough to fire the metabolism to get them to start losing. And if they're just skinny, like we had a guy just we did a 6-week challenge here. He lost 3% body fat and gained 6 pounds of muscle in 6 weeks.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah. Crazy. And so and literally it was because he just started eating more. I just want, for 6 weeks, you have to eat like a beast. I mean, just crush it.
Oh, yeah.
And he was so skeptical. He's like, really? Are you sure it's okay? But I thought I was supposed to be good paleo. It's like, no, man. Like, I want you to just feast. And sure as shit, lost some body fat, put on some muscle. Like, finally his body was like, yeah, there we go. This is what I've been waiting for. What do you think is a good a good number as far as like carbohydrates go? Is there any sort of correlation with like size? For let's say a guy is 175 pounds, right? And he wants to put on 10 pounds of muscle. What would you recommend as far as like meal timing, and overall like macro breakdown?
Yeah, so I usually start on most people just protein.
Okay.
Reason is that we have a fair amount of research on that, and it's relatively, I find in practice, just consistent from one person to the next. So you can give them more of a hard number, and they're pretty close. So with that, I'll use 0.7 grams per pound of body weight as a minimum. Yeah. So if they're a 200-pound guy, you're looking at about 140 grams of protein per day. That comes from studies like from Miro, from Donald Lehman's lab, Stu Phillips' lab, and they weren't necessarily hard training athletes, but they were chronic studies that were done in people who were recreationally active, and they had a high protein group and a low protein group. And they dramatically cut their calories by 40 to 60% when they enrolled in the study. So the question was, if we dramatically drop your calories, if you're eating low protein, do you lose lean body mass, right? So kind of the worst case scenario for what we're talking about. And what they saw is in the low protein group, they definitely did. So 0.7 was kind of the rough min to prevent people from losing. So
you're not saying that anything over that is pointless though, right?
Correct. Okay. And if you look at other research and you look at some acute data and things like that, you can make a okay argument. You get close to the 1 gram per pound of body weight if people are training pretty hard, and there's also the satiety effect and things of that. The reason I mentioned the 0.7 is that for some skinnier guys looking to gain weight, I've actually shifted them to paradoxically a lower protein, so like 0.7, 0.8, and then increase their carbohydrates to make sure that their training performance is better. And in some cases, that actually works better. Because you think if you're trying to eat like 1 gram per pound of body weight, and you're eating mostly whole food, that's a pretty high satiety. So it can be harder to get in all the rest of the other calories and that type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, that's the biggest barrier I feel like for me and for anybody who I've talked to about this. It's just the overall volume of food, the amount of calories you have to consume. And so my clients that I work with one-on-one who want to lose weight, I'll tell them, I got to eat like 4,000 calories a day if I want to be anabolic.
Yeah.
And they go, oh, lucky you. Oh, yeah. And I'm like, yeah. There's no doubt that you've eaten 4,000 calories here and there. Yeah. But we're talking
consistently
every day, 7 days a week for months and months and months on end to really get that kind of result.
Yeah. And I've done that in the past. I've gone over 4,000. I remember reading John Berardi's articles, early on massive eating and that kind of stuff. And I remember I did an internship and was carrying my little cooler with, and I actually had a stopwatch, the little digital watch that would beep every 2.5 hours. And I did that for almost 2 years straight. So I got from 180 to about 200, 205, because to get across 200 was really hard.
That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah. And for a while I was up to 4,300 calories for, I only made it 3 weeks, because if you're eating that much like real food, you're not just pounding Twinkies and Ho-Hos and anything else. You just get, it sounds bad, but you just get tired of eating. You don't want to cook. You don't want to look at food. Yeah. Your grocery bill gets to be astronomical. So I was trying to use more bananas and white rice and things that were cheaper and that type of thing. So it can be work, which I know to people trying to lose weight, that's not what they want to hear, but it definitely can be.
It is a lot of work. And in fact, sometimes when you go through a period of mass gaining, it's like a sweet release to just be able to just go down to a reduced calorie diet, increase your carb. I mean, it's almost like the sun comes up and the birds start singing.
It's like, I have so much time with my life.
Right. I was like, I get to cut my calories down to 2,000.
It's not a fork stuck to my hand.
Right. It is. It's very true.
But to answer about carbohydrates then, usually I'll set fat next. I usually go about 50 to 70 grams total per day of fat. Okay. So that's probably on the lower side. It's definitely not low fat. And then the reason for that is I would preferentially start people on a little bit higher carbohydrate. So an off day, usually about 120 grams. On a training day, usually around 200.
Okay.
And That's pretty much across the board for where I have people start, especially if they're doing pretty heavy weight training type things.
Right.
Unfortunately, I've seen carbohydrate tolerance vary just a massive amount from one person to the next.
Yep.
I had a figure competitor. It was a female, not very big, extremely lean. And 2-3 weeks out from her show, she's still eating over 230, 250 grams of carbohydrates. She'd easily get almost close to 400 in the off season.
Just to maintain her size?
She was losing, yeah.
Oh,
so
wow.
she's going into a show at that point.
Oh, wow.
So very, very, very high. I've had guys who are twice her size, eating way less than that.
Is there any risk associated with that? Right. So in other words, because I interviewed a former bodybuilder a couple episodes ago, and he's been increasing his carbohydrate intake by like 20-30 grams a week, and now he's over 400 grams a day.
Oh wow, that's pretty high.
Yeah, very high. He's like 180 pounds, and he looks great. He looks fantastic. But what happened at one point was he said that he was cutting his carbohydrates and his metabolism crashed or something along those lines, where all of a sudden he was just not processing carbohydrates, and he was saying he was like super low. I was down to like 150 a day, and I'm thinking that seems like a normal day for me. He's like, hey, I couldn't handle over 150. He's like, it's taken me a year now to rebuild where I'm up to 400 again. And it just seemed odd. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of risk associated with like that consistent consumption of carbohydrate at that level. Obviously, assuming you're still training, but it just seems like there might be, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I've had this discussion with people too, even about protein and carbohydrates, that at some point I think there's a trade-off on both hands. So on carbohydrates, usually I see this in more chronic endurance athletes who are very, very tuned to using carbohydrates. And if they're being very competitive, they're running very fast, they do take in a lot of carbohydrates. It makes sense for that type of performance. But there also were people who, if they didn't eat every 2 hours, they'd be like, feel like they're going to pass out on the floor in the corner. And that's not very healthy either. So what I do with people is I'll monitor like their heart rate variability. So I'll look at their monitors of stress. I'll look at their performance in the gym to make sure that if they are eating more carbohydrates, I should expect a little bit more performance out of the gym. So if they're dramatically eating more carbohydrates and their performance is staying the same or going down a little bit, then I'm going to look at some other factors. And then it's a little bit of a gray area, but I do have people or recommend them checking their glucose levels in the morning. Obviously, go to your physician, get your normal blood work drawn, things of that nature. But you can monitor your blood glucose in the morning. And I did that for a while, like a couple of years ago, right after I finished my PhD. And mine was like freaking borderline type 2 diabetic. Really?
Because that's a metric for figuring how well your body, how metabolizes glucose, right?
Yeah, it's just telling you, like, if you imagine that you go into your bathtub and you turn the faucet on and you open the drain, and the level of the water in the bathtub is your blood glucose. So the hard part is that you're only getting that snapshot of where kind of the water level is. Right. But if the water level is getting higher and higher and higher, something's off.
Right.
So I think you can have people who have super high carb intake, kind of like having the faucet wide open, but they probably also have a massive size drain. Right. So if they're exercising, 1 to 2 hours a day in the gym, especially doing kind of high volume bodybuilding type stuff, they may be okay because they're basically fluxing through that much glucose.
Right. It's like input output. It's just coming in and going out. Right. It just purely uses energy and burning it up.
Yep. And that's keeping their insulin sensitivity and things of that nature. For health reasons, though, I still would want them to do maybe some periods of fasting just to see how they tolerate it.
Yeah.
Because you can get, if you keep pushing insulin up high and high all the time, you can get to the case where you start losing the ability to use fat as a fuel. So you start losing metabolic flexibility. I've seen this on some performance testing, actually from Jeff Rothschild, who's here in Los Angeles also, looking at endurance athletes. And a couple of them had basically the crossover period just never happened. Meaning they never got below 50% use of fat. They were so tuned to using carbohydrates.
Right.
So performance standpoint, they were good. I do think they're sacrificing some stuff in health. I think so. So I think if you monitor stress, monitor performance, maybe blood glucose, get your standard lipids and blood drawn by your doc, just to keep an eye on it, because I think my gut feeling is it's just like you're pushing the red on the car.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And you may do fine for quite a while, and you may be okay. But when you get really close to that point, I found that physiology is also very non-linear.
Right.
That you can, once you kind of go over that cliff and you really implode, it's a long way back.
And maybe that's what this guy was talking about. Maybe he just pushed it too hard and had to fight his way back to a level playing ground.
And what you can see is for like bodybuilders or physique athletes that'll get super high carb levels, and the thought is, okay, when I go to diet, then I'll start at 400, and it's going to be so much easier because I'm going to have to go down and restrict carbohydrates to get really lean.
That makes sense.
And I do agree with that, and I think that's probably a good approach. The downside is that they sometimes forget is how fast or how steep you adapt coming down also. So if you have someone who you can just slowly lower them from 380, 370, 360, whatever, and they just take maybe 9 months to get down to 150, maybe you've got someone else who their body just adjusts right away to that lower amount. So they may end up going down really fast within a short period of time. So that it's not necessarily how high you can get, it's also the rate of how you're adapting on the other side on the way down too that matters.
That's so interesting. And so in regards of like just hormones, specifically growth hormone and testosterone, carbohydrates affect that. Everything really affects that, right?
Yep.
We're seeing a huge proliferation of just people going to their doctor now, and it's almost like what the marijuana industry was like.
Oh, I suppose, especially
10 years
here in
ago.
LA.
Oh yeah, yeah. You go to the weed doctor and be like, I got headaches and I have a problem with my
back kinda
appetite.
hurts.
Yeah. Oh, you need marijuana now. Now we're seeing that with growth hormone, and people are just going in and they're just googling what are the symptoms of low GH.
Low GH.
And then they go in. The doctors are literally prescribing them steroids, really. For lack of better word. So, what I preach, and I really would love to hear your take on this, is, we have so much of our own ability to create it naturally through things like, going to sleep with lower glucose levels, right? The sleep low study, you familiar with that one?
Yeah, there's one from Holly's lab from 2016. There's one from last year, but yeah.
So the idea, right, is that, these guys who had the same amount of carbohydrates as the other group, they just stopped eating them at 5 p.m. Or maybe it was even 4 p.m., but they were like high endurance athletes. They were eating 400 grams a day, split them into two groups. They still ate 400 grams a day. Just one of them stopped eating them at 4 p.m. The other group kept eating them until like 7 or 8. After 8 weeks, the group that stopped eating the carbohydrates at 4 p.m. had more muscle mass, less body fat, better overall performance. I mean, the idea is that growth hormone is suppressed if insulin is flowing. And if you go to sleep where growth hormone should be skyrocketing, but you go to sleep with excess glucose in your bloodstream, it suppresses that growth hormone. So by cutting the carbs a little bit earlier, you allow just more overall growth hormone to flourish in your bloodstream, all right? And essentially, give you those metabolic adaptations that we're all looking for.
I think so. The only caveats I would add to that is there's also the paradox of some people do better just sleep quality rise by having more carbs in the evening.
Oh, interesting.
So that's kind of interesting. And the other part we know that will disrupt sleep is blue light, stress, things of that nature too. So
you mean like that light on my printer that's looking right at me when I go to sleep?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. So I think the tricky part is that we definitely know that sleep quality will also alter your body's ability to use fat. So there's a study from a couple of years ago, and they took two groups. They had them both sleep 8 hours. The one group, they interrupted or did what's called fragmenting their sleep. So they would have to hit this button every hour, would go off, and then they go back to bed. So they would just wake up, and then they go back to bed. And they did that every hour. And between the two groups, this was done in a metabolic chamber, where they measure all the air in and out so you can see fat use versus carbohydrate use. What they found was that the group had the interrupted or the fractured sleep. Even though both groups were in bed for the same 8 hours, it impaired their ability to use fat by like 50%. Meaning that slight stressor pushed them to use a little bit more carbohydrates. So I think there's some stuff with sleep quality. It's still debatable how much like acute hormone changes matter. I think you can make an argument that out of all of them, growth hormone is probably the one that may have some okay evidence for it, being potentially lipolytic, things of that nature. We know that if you're using exogenous hormones, that it definitely does help with that. For testosterone, in terms of acute testosterone changes with exercise, Stu Phillips' lab, Dr. David West has done a fair amount of work in that area. And what they showed was that, if you go in and you back squat, you will see higher levels of hormones, especially testosterone. Bill Kramer's done this work for a long time.
Right.
So they had the ingenious idea of, okay, so let's take people, they'll back squat, and they'll do bicep curls with their right arm only. We'll give them a day off, and they'll come back the next day or 2 days, I think, and they'll do their left arm first and then their back squat. Right? So the theory being that if these acute levels of anabolic hormones matter, at the end of the study, the right arm should be bigger because that had the acute hormone release associated with the exercise. And just
to liaise on this a little bit, the idea is that when you go into like a heavy compound workout, back squats in particular in this case, it just releases, it stimulates more hormone production.
Correct.
Hormone is sort of it's non-biased. It just kind of floats in our bloodstream. So the idea is that if you start the workout with heavy back squats, which if you do the Performance Code strength and conditioning program, you know that I start every workout with deadlifts or back squats.
Nice.
And then you go into into an extremity, arms or chest or whatever. And the idea is that the hormones that you've stimulated from the back squats, the deadlifts, then go into the other muscle groups that you're training.
Right. And what they found at the end of the study was no different. So the right arm, not to piss on your leg until it's raining, but I just did.
I'm just kidding, guys. That's not part of the...
So from an so what's interesting, though, you bring up a good point, is that from a mechanistic standpoint, is that does acute testosterone make a difference? And most of their study would say no. Ronstadt, I think, was out of Denmark, had one study that said yes, but then Stu Phillips kind of looked at their data and said, no, I think the measurements they did there was probably no difference.
Oh, interesting.
So at the end of the day, if we look at designing an entire program to only increase acute hormone release, probably not useful in my opinion. However, I do programs extremely similar to the way that you have them set up. Is I will most of the time have the compound stuff first and then the accessory stuff. And in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I want sort of the bigger bang for your buck exercises first. I don't really want them to pre-fatigue their hamstrings or do anything that may change that form. I want the highest quality work, the thing that's going to cause the most volume, elicit the most muscle mass, increase the most strength. So I think from a programming standpoint, I actually agree that most of my programs are set up that way. Now, that's probably not just to get an acute hormone release, but I think there's also other reasons that I do like that design.
Sure, yeah, I agree. Just being more fresh in general before you go tackle your heavy lifts, where your mind is focused. So then, okay, so if acute hormone release isn't a proven strategy then for increasing your size and strength and other accessory parts, and then or just in general about utilizing the potential of hormones, and what is the strategy? So then what is to do to not have an acute hormone release, but just have a chronic hormone release that's just in balance with what their goals are?
Yeah, so there's only been one study I could find that looked at chronic hormone levels that are, say, because you've got a range, right? So if you're definitely hypogonadal, so you're super low in testosterone, yes, you're going to have a hard time gaining size, strength, all that kind of stuff. If you use, testosterone injections, however that may be, and you're in the supraphysiologic range, which is currently illegal, then yes, that definitely does help. Now, if you're low normal compared to high normal, does that matter that much? Only one study by Basheen where they chemically castrated males. So they gave them a drug to basically wipe out their testosterone
who the hell
production.
Is going to sign up for that?
I know. That's why they do is there's a lot of rat studies that have done this via castration. But castrating humans will never get IRB approval, I don't think. And this was in the mid-90s, so it may not even pass right now. And then they replaced them with injectable testosterone. And what they tried to do is get them in the low normal range and the high normal range, and then the other out extremes. And they didn't see much of a difference between low normal versus high normal. And I think that's because physiology is incredibly nonlinear. Because I get guys that email me all the time. They're like, "Oh man, I'm so mad. I have my testosterone check, dude, and it's only like 400, and my buddy's was like 850." And
right.
Yeah, I mean, all things being equal, I think guys in general want to be higher. You know, if I had a choice to go from 400 to 850, and there was like didn't cost me anything per se, it wasn't illegal, anything like that. Yeah, of course I would do it.
Well, but if it doesn't really reflect as far as your ability to put on muscle or strength, then what are the other factors then?
Yeah, so I do think that chronic levels do still matter, and the best way to probably get at it is just stress management.
Yeah.
Whether you're stressed out from sleep, poor nutrition, overtraining, overreaching, that type of thing. But in terms of strength and size, the biggest thing is performance. So I would say your performance on volume. So how much weight you can lift times your sets times your reps. So in essence, just how much work did you do? Because baked into that number is muscular tension, which is probably the main one. So the hormone hypothesis would say that it's the local growth factors that are probably released by the muscle that way out supersede any systemic type of hormones such as testosterone, things of that nature.
Right. So it's determined more by your actions than your conditions, in other words.
Yeah.
And the idea is that, the more signal you give to your body that it has to adapt, the more likely it will be, regardless of what is happening inside your hormone system.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating. So you look for overload, right? So volume, and then you can look at density. So CrossFit does a lot of density work. So volume divided by time, and then intensity. So intensity is the percentage of your 1RM or your 1 rep max.
Right.
Basically, how much load did you move?
Right.
And so those are the three things that I track in everyone's program. So if over time, and these will oscillate up and down, if they're all going up, I know that your performance is getting better. So I know by virtue of, let's say, if you went on a deadlift from, say, 3,000 pounds of volume per week to 10,000 pounds of volume per week over 5 months, you've done a lot more work. You've hit a lot more muscle mass. You've got a lot more intrinsic signaling, things of that nature. You definitely have put on a lot more local muscular tension. So all of those things get kind of wrapped up into that number.
Yeah.
And then the nice part about kind of focusing people on that is it's faster to see those changes than it is actual hypertrophy changes.
Right.
So hypertrophy changes, you're talking in someone who's semi-trained 5, maybe 10 pounds per year, maybe. And that's debatable. It's definitely not 20, 30, 40.
So then where do you fall in this whole myofibrillous sacroplasmic hypertry?
Yeah, which is crap.
That's kind of what I'm getting to, right? You read these different schools of thought, and you're like, it just seems hard. It seems like they're reaching for it. The theory is sacroplasmic. You're just higher reps. You're just forcing glycogen. You're increasing the capacity for which your muscle can store glycogen, right?
Yeah, the theory of sarcoplastic hypertrophy, which it just doesn't even make any sense, is a short version. The only way your muscle is going to get bigger long term. Now we can do things like depleted glycogen, because glycogen pulls in a lot of carbohydrates and pulls in more water than anything else. But if the muscle itself is going to get bigger, you have to add basically actin-myosin and contractile protein to it. That's kind of the short version.
So then if someone were only doing sets 5 and under, and they put on 5 pounds of muscle over a period of time, is there any difference between that and someone who was doing sets of 10 to 15 who put on 5 pounds of muscle over a similar period of time?
Yeah. So there's some really cool studies now. Dr. Brad Schoenfeld has done some of these. Some of these are from Stu Phillips' lab also, showing that you can get by with super low weight and moderate to higher volume, right? So maybe 50%, maybe as low as 30%. You can start getting into blood flow restriction, things of that nature. Where the thought in the past was that at some point, if you get just too low, you're not going to see any hypertrophy.
Right. It's just you're just using up ATP, right? Just the
Right. So the takeaway is that if you're looking for hypertrophy changes, you can do all sorts of stuff. You can do volume approach. You can do a little bit more higher strength stuff. You can do, I'd say, lower load stuff. If I were to pin it on just one variable, probably volume, although some of the work done to fatigue kind of messes with that a little bit. But for strength, right? So imagine this, right? So a guy comes into the gym. He says, okay, we're going to do bench press. We're going to do old school DeLorme 3x10 reps, right? Because every dude bra and their brother's done 3x10 reps, right? And his buddy comes in and goes, I heard that's bunk. I'm going to do 10x3. I'm going to do 10 sets of 3 reps. Now, if we force them to use the same amount of weight, right, the volume between those groups would be identical. But if you retest them, the strength will be a little bit higher in the 10x3. Why? Because that's more specific, right? Reverse, if you do a lot of bodybuilding, let's say 12 to 15 reps, you can definitely add hypertrophy. But if you were to go max out your strength, let's say in that exercise, you probably didn't get a lot stronger per se. Because strength is a lot more of a neurologic component. There's a lot more learning components in that, and you need to practice that specific skill to get a little better at that.
Right, and I think a perfect example of that is Olympic lifting.
Oh, by far, yeah, that's the extreme. Yep.
Right, I mean these guys are not big guys, but yet they're able to. Some of them are huge, by the way. But a lot of them, like some of these,
especially the weight class ones, are not, I would say, huge mammals.
Yeah, and you're seeing them snatching 315.
And
well, how the hell do they do that? And this is the idea of where strength is a skill. And I think maybe the layman or just an average person can maybe access on any given day 60 or 70% of their potential strength. And then every, percentage point closer to that 100% strength you get just takes time. And it's a developed skill that you have to nurture and get to where you feel comfortable with that kind of weight in your hand. And
a lot of it's coordination too. You're doing a complex motor skill on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, man. Well, I think we've given the audience enough to chew on for one
thoroughly
episode.
Confused them for a while.
Yes, exactly. Well, hey, man, thanks a lot for coming. That was a lot of fun.
That was fun.
Where can people find you? Social media. I mentioned in the beginning that your website is just MikeTNelson.com. Anywhere else people should be directed to look you up?
Yeah. They can find me on the web, just MikeTNelson.com. If they want to hop on my newsletter, I do have a done for them template formula that has training, nutrition, lifestyle, monitoring, everything.
Perfect.
It's normally like $97 a month, but it's free. They can just go to MikeTNelson.com /muscle, MUSCLE. So MikeTNelson.com /muscle. Put in their email and their name, and we'll send it out to them for free.
Perfect. Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, that is it for this episode. Stay tuned next week for another great show with another fitness expert. See you guys then. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to The Performance Code, the official podcast of PCodeNation.com, with your host, Justin Schollard, online at PCodeNation.com. We'll catch you next time.